address it, they were a little surprised with my answer, going, well, by some accounts, the government actually created it in the first place. It was at that point during the night in the restaurant, Julian goes, well, so, that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years. What are you up to? I said, oh, I'm about to go work at DARPA. So that's my first story. Second story is about Anonymous and the Department of Defense. I remember Anonymous from way back. I mean, Anonymous, I use it as like, a proper noun, but obviously we're all familiar, and it's much more, it's kind of a movement, a thought, it's more ephemeral than that. And when I remember them, they were going after Scientology and RIAA, and there was all the 4chan sort of soap opera stuff going on. And at some point, their scope or the target, expanded to include the government. And general wisdom was that the triggering event was the DoD's response to WikiLeaks and Manning, etc. But the way I saw it, there was actually something else that was a bit more subtle that folks hadn't realized. So in 2011, the DoD released the Strategy for Operating in Cyberspace. There was some very minor backlash to some of the wording initially. I think there was an initial, small leaked version of it that went out, and it was followed by a later one. But there was some more specific backlash and chatter in the hacker researcher community. The strategy stated that the DoD was going to, treat cyberspace as a domain to conduct operations in, and it appeared kind of modeled off of outer space, treating space as, these are DoD-ish words, a domain. And there were some confused conversations going on, why is anybody upset if you treat cyberspace as a domain? There wasn't that much upset with treating space, and nobody lives in cyberspace, which you could kind of only hear inside the government, like a statement like that. Because if you think about it, we all live in cyberspace, and the hacker researcher community made made cyberspace. I'm really not a fan of that word. Made the internet and online, our homes, well before the government and everybody else kind of made it just where they always lived and did everything in. So if you send a message that that's somebody's backyard and that you're going to militarize and prep for war in somebody's backyard, that can sound really scary. And it can galvanize folks to respond. One of the problems was there was not an understanding as to who the message was actually intended for. So in addition to treating it as a domain, they said something else, which was, and in response to, and I'm paraphrasing, but in response to hacks, we'll consider responding with kinetic force. So if you don't actually specifically call out who the recipient of the message is, everybody reading it thinks it's directed to them. I read it. I thought it was directed to me. And I'm going like, what the heck? I joke my buddy and I replace his HTML, the main web page, and that's considered a hack, and all of a sudden I've got somebody launching a Patriot missile at me. I mean, this makes no sense. What level of hack? Because if we look at like CFAA response, maybe they actually think a Patriot missile is the right thing for, defacing a website. I don't know. And none of these are the right questions because I'm not the intended audience. But of course I'm reading it as if I was. And of course the logical next question is, wait, do they understand how attribution works? Because, what if I do it, bouncing through an ally? What if I do it from within the U.S.? Are they going to kinetically respond against themselves? I mean, and you kind of go, okay, wait, back up. If the message were directed to, let's say, other countries, somebody in specific that's got a significant power, that they say, look, we're talking about critical infrastructure or something of that nature. If you turn off the lights in New York, we'll probably be able to figure out who you are because you're not a small little hacker-defacing websites, and maybe there's attribution in place that we can respond to. That would have been an entirely different sort of message. And I wouldn't have read it as the whole like, wow, if I get root on something in my own system, you mean is the government going to shoot me? Which is just silly, but I wasn't the only person who read it that way. And it's nice having been in this field and in the hacker researcher community for, geez, going on almost 25 years. Well, actually, over 25 years. And some folks were sending me, they're like, hey, have you seen what's going on in the chat rooms? And there were some folks who were claiming affiliation or claiming support of Anonymous that were going, hey, have you read this? Look who's trying to prep for war in our backyards. Do they even understand how attribution works? This is bullshit. If they think they can find me, it's on. Let's go. And the next thing you know, there were a couple websites defaced. And they ended in like .gov. Now, this is where it gets kind of funky. Defacing a website is kind of a message. It's a little warning shot. But that's in a language that govies don't know. So the govies didn't get the message as far as, what I saw. So here's the initial strategy for operating in cyberspace that goes out. It's probably directed to somebody else, but by poor messaging is misinterpreted by a group. The group responds, fires a warning shot. The warning shot isn't understood, and it's like, hey, what are these vagabonds doing? Look at the little street punks or whatever. They're not somebody who actually has a message that we should actually engage in, and it's just this little cascading effect. So that's kind of unfortunately where I saw, the expanding of scope and a lot of misunderstandings. I'm not saying the two groups should be friends. And I'm not saying one group is good and one group's bad. But when you send a message out into the world, and this is for both groups, you really need to make sure it's understandable by all the parties that are going to receive it. You can't assume it's just going to be read by the person you had in mind. With all love and respect, there's one very obvious commonality between the hacker researcher group and the government, and is that they can be very arrogant and expect everybody will speak their own language and that they don't have to speak anybody else's. And I think that's a really common mistake. So the recommendation for the government, from my vantage point of both sides, is figure out how your messages are going to be received by the more general populace of cyberspace, because we all live there now. This is actually a great opportunity for diplomacy. And you can kind of think of it like the lost city of Atlantis, because cyberspace kind of took them, I think, the world by surprise. Obviously hasn't been around that long. So what if Atlantis just popped back up and there was an advanced, very technically capable group of people there? You wouldn't sit there and ignore them. You wouldn't taunt them. You wouldn't attack them. You'd probably actually try and understand them and figure out how messaging to somebody else might be interpreted to them. You might even try and figure out where you guys already, see things eye to eye and where you have differences. So my recommendations to the citizens of cyberspace is keep in mind that the government, and in particular the DoD, has very specific focuses and goals. And they often only see things from their own point of view because they're really focused on doing that job. And when you read things that appear to be a message directed to you or your community, coming from an unlikely source, you should question whether or not the message is actually intended for you, or if it's just intended for somebody else and really poorly worded. And if you still think a response is necessary, you really need to think about the message that you're sending to make sure that you don't make the same mistake in return. My third story is, well, let me give you a little background. I'd have a lot of people approach me outside of work and go, hey, Mudge, you know what's going on. We're all owned. And these were large companies that are oftentimes funded by taxpayer money. I'll just say that they're large government contracting organizations. And it's like, hey, why don't you start a program that actually pays us to go clean up the compromises, or at least figure out what happened and how bad the damage was? Isn't that your job? And it made me think that there's not a financial incentive for these companies to actually go fix the problems. So the next question was, is the inverse true? Can government contractors actually make more money by remaining compromised and continuing to lose intellectual property? So this talk is called Game Theory's a Bitch. I was having dinner with, a lot of these stories are because I'm outside having dinner somewhere. I don't cook. I was having dinner with an old friend, and his company goes in and cleans up APT after, big well-known names get compromised, in particular, whether they're government contractors or commercial organizations. And he posed a really interesting hypotheticals because we were just shooting the crap back and forth. And he said, hey, what do you think about the following chain of events? First, RSA gets compromised. Networks defended by their tools are vulnerable, and as a result, a defense contractor gets compromised. Said defense contractor, if you look up on Wikipedia, is the one who made this really cool stealth drone. Later, a really cool stealth drone goes missing over in a Middle Eastern state. Like, what do you think about that chain of events? I'm like, that's terrifying. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, no, for an entirely different reason. Look at it this way. I have no clue. That's a hypothetical, and there were a whole bunch of rumors about what had happened. But let's assume that you, as a country or a large organization, that your advantage is technology. You can field the fastest and the best technology, so you're ahead of everybody. That's your advantage. Newest, most advanced toys. Someone else steals some of your tech. What do you have to do? You got to replace it with newer tech, right? You got to keep your advantage. So suppose a government contractor gets some of their super tech toll, and what does their government customer actually need to do? Well, the government in that case, and this is all a game theory hypothetical, need to pay someone to make the next version so that the people who just stole it don't achieve parity, so that they're not even. They could go to some other government contractor because, of course, the one in question just lost everything, but they actually most likely won't. And here's probably why. The initial contract for very expensive research efforts can take a long time to put in place. You're talking over a year, sometimes longer than, sometimes you measure it in years rather than months. Now, as part of the coolness of CFT is that we are measuring that in days. Imagine if you're under something, sequestration is what we're under now, it can take even longer. So if a government agency wanted to start a new program to replace tech, so that's essentially starting the same program to do the same thing that you were already paying somebody to do, it's tough to get permission to do that because you got to go justify taxpayer money, and we just gave you the money to do that. And B, when you spin it back up, you're going to have to redo a lot of work. You're going to have to redo the contracting that you already had in place. You're going to have to spin people up to speed on management side. You're going to have to respin up the tech side, and you've spent years putting that in place. So why wouldn't you just go back to the people that you already have a relationship with, already have a contract with, they already know what they lost, or maybe you know what they lost and stuff, and you can tell them because they're your customer. So you just pay them to give you the next thing. Remember, they're not financially incentivized to go fix how they were actually compromised in the first place or clean it up. Because staying with a really familiar solution or situation is comfortable, which